The route you choose is often one of the biggest factors as to whether an M+ run will succeed or fail. With a bad route, even with perfect play, it may not be possible to time a key, whereas a solid route, even with a few mistakes, can result in a timed key. But what actually makes a solid route? By the end of this video, I am going to give you all of the information you would need to build the best routes possible in Mythic+. I'm not just going to spoon feed you the routes, I'm going to teach you all of the tools that you need to be able to do it yourself. The issue at the moment is that very few people actually know what goes into making a good route. Is it purely just pulling as many mobs as the tank can handle? Do you take whatever mobs in the dungeon give you the most count? Do you pull the entire first section onto the boss with Lust to save infinite time? Realistically, very few people actually know, and to make matters even more complicated, what might be a good route often shifts depending on the key level. Something that may be good at a +12 could be horrible at a +16, and then something that is good at a +16 might be terrible at a +18. This leads to an awkward situation where people tend to just blindly follow routes that they find online. I mean, we've all seen this, right? You jump into your weekly +10 only for some psychotic tank to try the most intricate MDI route imaginable. Your group promptly wipes, everyone blames the tank for being a spud, and the tank protests that he saw Kira do that route on stream the other day. Now, is the route bad? Well, obviously not. It was done by one of the best tanks in the world. Is the route good for a no comms +10? Also no. Does the tank even know why the route was good when Kira did it in their key? Again, definitely not. Does using Kira's route make you play like Kira? No, it does not. So in this video, we're going to break down what goes into making an M+ route successful and all the factors that you need to consider when building your own. If you enjoy this type of video, make sure you like and subscribe and all that stuff. And if you do so, I personally guarantee that you'll never get a Lua error ever again. The first thing to consider is the relationship between the speed of a route and the risk that it carries, or the probability of failure, I suppose. Generally speaking, faster routes will do each dungeon in less total pulls, and the faster a route is, the higher the risk of failure. Now, I've made this simple graph to illustrate this point. So for one situation, we can have a route that pulls all packs one at a time with breaks in between. Obviously, this is very slow, but it also has next to no risk of wiping, so it ends up at this portion of the graph. On the flip side, we can have a route that pulls every single pack onto the first boss. It's extremely fast, but the risk of wiping is almost certain. Now, this is pretty obvious when you're looking at the extremes, but we can also use this information a little bit more. Let's say you're in a weekly +10, and the speed required is roughly here. You want a route that is fast enough to go past this point with a little bit of margin to allow for mistakes, while not going too far. Kira's +21 Gambit route might be way up here. It's insanely fast. But the reason for this is because the speed that they require in this key is also extremely high. The trick is a route needs to be risky enough to meet the speed check, while not being so unnecessarily risky that the wipe probability goes through the roof. Quick little interlude, if you want to support the channel, check out the membership options below by clicking the join button. This ranges from access to premium Discord all the way up to intricate video shoutouts throughout the month. Anyone who wants to join the Discord but can't support for whatever reason, just join and flick me a message and I will grant access, no questions asked. With that out of the way, let's discuss what makes a route risky and what makes a route fast. A good start point here is pull size and also what mobs are in those pulls. So first up, we'll have to consider key targets. These are mobs that are just insanely dangerous on their own, no matter how many other mobs are around them. I think a really good example of this is the Sentinels in Ecodome. Once they hit 50%, they'll do pulsing AoE damage to the group, which just trucks everyone. Generally speaking, if we look at an example pull like this one here, it might only have 7 mobs in it, but having 2 Sentinels at the same time makes it extraordinarily dangerous, nonetheless. A general rule of thumb is that we'll only want one of these big key targets in any given pull. Next up is what I'll call tank mobs. These are mobs that might not be super dangerous to the party as a whole, but will just obliterate the tank. In Dawnbreaker, these Shadow Walker and Tactician pulls are the best example. They do enormous tank damage, too many of them without proper cooldowns from the tank and the healer, and the tank is basically going to flop. And thirdly, casters. In general, the more casters there are, the more dangerous the pull is, and the more coordination that's needed to actually succeed that pull. This simply comes down to a group only having a set number of abilities that can either kick or prevent the casts, which can be pretty quickly overwhelmed. A good rule of thumb to try and keep to, especially if you're not in comms, is for each pack to contain no more than 2 casters. This is generally enough for the group to be able to easily rotate between their abilities, even if there's some overlaps. The exception to this rule will be casters that are not spam casting. So if we look at these Fast Stalkers in Ecodome, they are technically casters, but they will only cast every so often, so we can go above 2 quite comfortably with this. So let's put this into practice. To make the fastest route possible, we want to have as fewer pulls as possible. So this first pull here fits our criteria. There is no insanely dangerous key targets. We only have 2 kicks. The mobs aren't doing a super huge amount of tank damage beyond just the fact that there's quite a lot of them, and there's no excessive group damage that the healer couldn't handle. We then go do the boss, obviously, and go on to the next pull. Would we say that this is a risky pull? Yes, we have 2 sentinels, so we'd probably want to avoid this and structure it in a different way. So something more along these lines. Fast forward, a route like this would be quite fast, and it only takes 12 total pulls. But we also need to bear in mind, do we need to take these risks? While none of this is unnecessarily risky, it is important to remember, how fast do we actually need to go? If this was, say, a plus 18 at the current time, I'd say this is a good route. The timer at that point is starting to get a little bit tighter, so we're going to want to be moving a lot quicker and taking these risks. For a plus 10, this is just way, way faster than we need. And as such, I would say is an unnecessarily high level of risk. So we might want to opt for something like this instead. More pulls, but they're less dangerous, and they still leave us with ample time to complete the key within the limit. Now, when structuring pulls, we also need to consider group composition and what utility is available. Let's look at this pull in Floodgate. It's quite fast. It doesn't carry unnecessary amounts of risk, but these demolitionists won't move on their own. Now, if we had a group with a DK, this would be fine. We could grip them together and continue on. But if we were running, say, Retribution Paladin, Fury Warrior, and Marksman Hunter, well, all of a sudden these mobs can't be pulled together, and the pull becomes really slow because they just stay permanently spread out. We can also look at this pull in Priory. Now, this was done last season in a group that I was running with, but I think it's a really good example still. This definitely breaks our rule of trying to maintain 2 casters. It has 4. However, we are running here with a Vengeance Demon Hunter, a Druid, a Mage, and a Shaman, and then me as a Ret Paladin. In this case, we have Sigils, we have Beam, we have double Cap, we have double Mage displacements, we have a lot of short cooldown kicks. We can basically permanently lock down these casters, and the fact that we're also in Discord communicating this makes that even more effective. So this is an important note to consider when you're constructing a route. While some pulls may look fast or risky, the question is, does the group actually have the tools to deal with it? Are you running all ranged DPS and a ranged healer? You can probably pull like loader bots onto a Blood Warper after the second boss in Floodgate. Are you running a group with long kick cooldowns and minimal silences? Well, 2 casters might need to be the absolute hard limit when you're making your route. The danger or inefficiencies of some mobs can be mitigated by certain abilities of the classes that you bring to your key, and trying to do pulls that are structured around having those classes can take a route that is, in one sense, really good and turn it into being really bad. This is why copy-pasting some routes, especially those done by really high-level players, is not always a great idea, because those routes are generally constructed with the abilities of the players in the group kept in mind. This also segues nicely into DPS cooldowns and Bloodlust timings. Now, this can be hard to juggle in the planning phase and would normally require you to adjust mid-key. However, both the risk and speed of a dungeon is pretty heavily dependent on DPS cooldown availability and Bloodlust timing. Let's take a look at Dawnbreaker here. We are running this route here and we're looking to do pull 7. It's quite dangerous. There's 2 kicks. There's a lot of really heavy tank damage. There's a lot of really heavy group damage. If you looked at this and then went, okay, we're going to this pull next, but your CD tracker says that all of your major cooldowns are up for your DPS, you can pretty much just roll into it and pump away. However, on the flip side, if you look and you see that your mage doesn't have Touch of the Magi for 60 seconds, your DK has Pillar but no Breath of Sindragosa, it might be smarter to instead go to pull 6 here and then come back to pull 7 once everyone's cooldowns are available. So this is known as a recovery pull. Effective routes are pretty much structured in a way that DPS cooldowns are available for the most dangerous parts of the dungeon, and then smaller or less dangerous pulls are done in between to allow those cooldowns to come back. Now, this can be hard to juggle in practice because key level will change pretty drastically how long a pack takes to die, and therefore it'll change how long it will take for the cooldowns to then come up after that. But it's an important thing to bear in mind. And it's also important that when you're running a route, you can adjust like the pull order to account for different cooldowns being up or not up. Now, for Bloodlust, you generally want to have as many uses per key as possible, unless they are not very effective uses. So generally speaking, you'll want to be sending it as close to on cooldown as possible. However, there are some exceptions. Let's go with Floodgate again. You're on pull 5 here. Lust is available. You're sitting at 12 minutes on the timer. Now, you could use it right now and you'd get 2 more uses effectively, because that's how many would fit within the time window, because it's a 33-minute dungeon. However, you definitely want it for Big Mama, because that's a much more effective use of the cooldown. So in this case, you would either go straight to Big Mama somehow, whether you skip and pull some of the front mobs on, or use like Shroud or Invis Pots or something, or you would simply forgo the extra use and just opt instead for having 2 solid uses of Lust rather than 3 mediocre ones. And lastly, in the DPS realm, damage profiles are really important to consider. With most comps, you'll typically want to be pulling some low intensity mobs or packs onto a boss to allow funnel classes like mages or demon hunters or rogues to do more damage to the boss. As such, a lot of the extra mobs that are pulled onto bosses aren't actually there because of like the efficiency of killing them with the boss, but it's there to pump up the damage of these funnel classes to make them kill the boss faster. The important thing to note here is when you're looking at your group composition as you're going into a key, if you've got a lot of funnel specs, it might be a good idea to even chain different packs onto a boss, because it's going to allow them to be able to move through it a lot quicker. However, if you're running a really paddy sort of setup, I don't know, Ret Paladin, Boomy, Devastation Evoker, it's probably not even worth doing it in the first place. So you can bear this in mind when you're sort of structuring whether you want to pull something onto a boss or not. Again, though, we do need to ask ourselves, do we need to take these added levels of risk to actually time a key at the given level? Is the time requirement at a plus 14 high enough that we need to be pulling lots of funnel onto bosses or doing like massive pulls of casters? The answer is no. Generally speaking, below very, very high levels of keys, safer routes that follow good principles are going to be more than effective enough to time a key. The other thing to remember on top of this is you get very little reward for timing a key a minute or 2 minutes faster. However, you effectively lose everything if you take unnecessary risks and then die because you brick the key and you don't get anything from it. So another good area to touch on is mob efficiency. This is mainly based off of the percentage that the mob gives in relation to the percentage HP that it gives. So if a mob has really high HP and gives really low count, it's an inefficient mob, and then vice versa. We won't dive into the specifics because like the calculations aren't really relevant, but in general, you can judge this based on this score given in MDT. Higher score equals a more efficient mob. When deciding what packs to pull, this can be the decider of which mobs to actually add into each section. The only exception here is what I would classify as like really dangerous meat shields or something along those lines. Things like these big creepers in Ecodome, they have a good efficiency score, but they're bulky to the point that pulling things onto them is actually really tough, and they come with a lot of their own risk to the group. So in this case, they are reasonably efficient from a pure numbers point of view, but they may not be a great choice because of the risk that they bring. The other thing to consider is what I would call like nothing mobs. If we look back again at Floodgate, we can take these crocodiles onto the first boss. Now, these are worth like next to no count. However, they don't really do much aside from slapping the tank around a little. So they can be a perfect candidate for what we would call like free count. And they will also then provide funnel damage to the mage, which will make the boss go faster. The final thing to consider is how coordinated is the group that you're in. This hasn't been a huge factor this season, but fast routes in the past typically involve some sort of intricate skips or pulls that require a lot of coordination or knowledge or just individual player skill. On the first pull of Ecodome, jumping over the ledge here is an easy skip, so no worries. It doesn't really matter what the skill is, as long as the person has a spacebar, they're fine. On the flip side, at the start of Priory, you could be sigil skipping these first packs here with Meld and then invis potting to get past the knights and following this very particular path to make sure that you don't aggro anything. This is really fast, but it's also kind of tricky. Another example is pulling these 4 big dudes onto the first boss in Gambit. It's really fast, but are you playing with people that you know are quite skilled at the game, or are they just like your weekly guildies who like to chill out in tens and dodging ground circles is actually going to be really tough for them? This all comes down to the situation or the context that you're in. If you're in a +10 with randoms who are just trying to fill their vault and they all have a score of 2.4k, probably don't do any weird pulls or skips. You're in a +18 with your regular group in Discord, sure, these are the things that you can definitely look at doing. Not only because you probably need to for time, but also because you can be reasonably confident that the group can actually pull it off. But always ask yourself as you're going through, do we actually need to do this to time this key? Would you be better off sacrificing 30 seconds to ensure that the run has less risk while still being fast enough to time it? Awesome example of this is even when doing title keys last season, there were routes in most of the dungeons that we were doing that were objectively faster than what we were currently using. However, the risk that they brought was unnecessarily high and we didn't need to do it to still be able to time the key. Now, I've talked a lot about how to judge routes based on this sort of risk-reward metric, but the thing that I hear asked a lot is, how do I know how fast I actually need to go? Now, there's 2 answers for this, I think. Firstly, I would say any key below roughly a top, say, 2% level, which I think at the moment would be about a +15 or 16, is timeable as long as you use a solid route with decent principles. If you have, say, no more than 2 casters if possible, reasonably efficient mobs, no doubling up on dangerous key targets, giving some funnel on bosses with relatively benign and easy to handle mobs, and doing the dungeon in a reasonable amount of pulls, assuming all of the DPS players are actually playing reasonably well, there's no need to attempt anything riskier. You will be able to time the key. The second part, as you get above that 2% mark, is where it gets a little bit more complicated and it's more trial and error. As you climb higher, the timer will start to challenge your route more and more. Eventually, you'll get to a point where you simply just have to adjust your route to be more risky. So I generally would go about it like this. Build or use a route that is like reasonably fast, and just makes sense from a fundamental point of view. And then as you climb, watch the timer. Did you just finish a plus 17 with one death that went really smoothly, but you only had 10 seconds to spare? Well, you now know that your route needs to be a lot more aggressive and risky for the plus 18. Otherwise, you'll likely not be able to time it. And also probably needs to be more risky and aggressive for the plus 17 because there's very little margin for mistakes with the way that you just did it. Did you just time a different plus 18 with 3 minutes to spare and 6 deaths? Your route is solid. You can use that in the 19 comfortably. So this part sort of comes with practice. The reason that the MDI players and the front page pushers do these really intricate and dangerous routes is because A, they're skilled enough to do it, obviously, but also because their team has reached a point where that is the only viable way for them to be able to time the key, because any less risk would make the run too slow and they wouldn't meet the time check. So wrapping that up, if you're below a top, say, 2% player based on your Raider IO, just use solid routes with solid principles and nothing too crazy. As you get above that, use these routes that are constructed in a reasonable way and just watch the timer to see where the point where the dungeon level starts to challenge the route is, and then adjust accordingly. I know this is probably a lot of information to digest, so I've timestamped everything to skip back to sections that you might want to rewatch. Otherwise, do all the YouTube stuff, like, comment, sub, and thank you for watching. Until next time, gamers, take care.